Among the many debates that have taken place in the video game industry over the last few years, few have reached a discussion level as heated as anything involving the word cinematic. When games like The Walking Dead or Gone Home got popular, many people got angry. When developers said they were keeping frame rates at 30 frames per second to give their game a more cinematic feel, many people got angry. There seems to be an ongoing notion of movie influences supposedly turning video games into something they aren't or shouldn't ever be. So what is it exactly that makes people's blood boil? Well, more and more players get tired of games that sacrifice gameplay to make room for the story compartment. They get tired of games becoming overly linear and homogeneous. And they get tired of games that keep taking away the player's control all 5 minutes for yet another unskippable cutscene or an orchestrated quick time event. But if movie influences are allegedly bad for games, then maybe we should first ask ourselves, what is a game? Or rather, let's channel our inner Niklas Luhmann and start thinking in differences. What differentiates games from movies? Hell, from any other entertainment medium? Dedicated hardware and software obviously, but the biggest unique feature of games is, of course, interactivity. You read a book, you watch a movie, you listen to music, and on a technical level, all of these are linear experiences. Only games with the means of a player input device contain a way for the consumer to directly alter the events that are happening within the medium. And yes, stupid as it may be, from a definition standpoint, even the most cinematic games require specific player input. They are not literally playing themselves. Clearly, there are ways to spend 200 hours on The Wolf Among Us and still not make it to the ending of the game, simply by pressing the wrong buttons at the wrong time, right? But it seems this very concept of player interactivity, the most unique feature of the entire medium, is what gamers are afraid of losing when movie influences find their way into video games. I have seen people get legitimately angry when others refer to Heavy Rain as a game because they simply did not want this cutscene heavy object with barely any gameplay in it associated with a video game medium. Are these kinds of cinematic games a problem? Do they need to go away? My answer is no, and also partially yes, but mostly stop using a strawman argument. Cinematic influences in video games are not the core issue here. In fact, and I want to make a fairly obvious suggestion, why can't we just mix these two to create something new? Am I the only one to realize that there is a lot of potential in mixing interactive player input and a heavy focus on story? If you were to create a narrative that really builds itself around what the player decides should happen, you could create a single story with such infinite possibilities that basically none of them ever would play out the same. At least in theory. But no, of course I'm not the first one to think of that. Choose your own adventure books are a thing. Pen and paper games that work with a guiding manual are a thing. Role-playing games with giant dialogue trees are a thing, and all of these are attempts at creating a succession of narrative events while being open to player input. And I guess if you were to take games like The Walking Dead seriously, even in these supposedly cinematic games, the story is tailored by how you play. So when you see cinematic games as an actual mixture of the qualities of film and game, there's room for giant potential and innovation here. This doesn't have to ruin gaming, it's a hybrid, a unique niche that may or may not be filled. Sure, it wouldn't feature deep gameplay, but it would create something that only this niche, by taking these very attributes from both media, could create. Yet, and this is where I do concede that people who dislike these games very well have a point, right now that potential is not tapped in the slightest. I mean, look at the games Telltale has released in the past years, and they are still acquiring new franchises to this day. Why is it that these games, and I quote, adapt to the choices I make, and yet there's not a single choice in any of these that is as meaningful and important as, for example, choosing to go with Roach or Yorveth in Witcher 2? I don't think I have to remind anyone that Witcher 2 is also a full game with crafting and customization and non-linear questing and combat and good graphics, so why in fuck is it also better at doing what Telltale games are supposed to be specializing in? And then look at Life is Strange. The gimmick of Life is Strange is that the main character can literally rewind time. How can anyone look at this and not see the unbridled potential of giving the player a tool to disrupt the narrative, go back in time at his own will, and alternate the past to change the present or future? The people would write songs about you if you came through with that idea. You could create a story that rivals the legacy of Cain in chronological non-linearity and yet have the player decide when and how it unfolds. Fuck gameplay, that is exactly the kind of story building that can only be achieved by crossing a story-driven medium with the interactivity of gaming. And what does Life is Strange actually do with that mechanic? Let you rewind about a minute of game time at a piece so that you can switch out some minor detail and be railroaded into the next linear scene. Well, good fucking job. And then of course we have games like the recently released The Order 1886, which does not have a branching narrative, which does not even have a good story or good gameplay or anything other than looking pretty and dragging you through cutscenes, shooting galleries and quick time events. And this happens to the point where your input into the game is of such little consequence that yeah, you might as well be watching this as a movie and barely miss out on anything. These are the worst kinds of offenders when it comes to cinematic gaming, because they cut down on the gameplay aspect without in any way redeeming it through innovative storytelling or anything else. They take away the interactive aspect and give you nothing in return. And I will say this, as a trend in gaming this is definitely frightening, but that does not turn cinematic games themselves into the problem. The problem lies with the developers and publishers who push movie aspects into games not with the intention of creating something innovative, but with the intention of making the average game more accessible, and that hurts. But let me end on a positive example. You can throw a lot of warranted criticism towards Heavy Rain, sure, but it did do one thing. It gave you a selection of main characters who all played a role in the story, and it also made it possible for these characters to die at certain points if the player screwed up. And when they died, it did not mean game over. It meant the story went on without them, which lent itself nicely into an array of different possible endings and plot conclusions that actually corresponded with what happened throughout the story. This is a first step into what cinematic games should really be doing, and personally I want to at least remain hopeful that it will happen eventually. Not to destroy interactivity, but to fill a niche that may be well worth filling. Until then, BoukenJima signing out.